My name is Eric, and this is Daily Drivers, where we investigate whether or not various operating systems are seriously usable on a day-to-day basis. In my intro video to this series, I said that I wouldn't be dealing with Linux, except for some edge cases. While that's mostly true, I still feel the need to do a video covering a few modern iterations of Linux, mostly to compare them to older versions and also other operating systems. And yes, the pronunciation is Linux. Things like Linux are just butchered versions. For anyone who doesn't know what Linux is, it's a Unix-like operating system created by a Finnish student named Linus Torvalds in 1991. Or rather, Linus created the kernel. Many other people created the rest of the system, and for that matter, many people have contributed to the kernel itself over the past 30 years. Linux is by far the most popular of a class of operating systems collectively known as Unix-like, or as I more often write it, Starnix. Linux is the most widely used server OS with an estimated double install base as Windows Server, but that's not really relevant to this video. Linux is also the basis for Droid or Android, which is the most widely used system for cell phones in the world, but that's also not relevant. For the purposes of this video, when I say Linux, I'm referring to any desktop system that is built on top of the Linux kernel. Some people, notably Richard Stallman, would prefer it to be called GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux, and while that has caught on to some degree, I am way too lazy to say that every time I name the system. As of this writing, the current version of the kernel is 5.13.12, released August 18, 2021, but by the time I publish the video, that may have changed. For end users, there probably isn't much difference between modern versions of the kernel and older versions, aside from support for specific hardware devices. Linux runs on pretty much any 32 or 64-bit CPU you'd care to try it on, although support for the Intel 386, which was the original development target, was dropped at the end of 2012. If you're still running a 386, you can still use Linux, you're just limited to no newer than kernel 3.7. I've seen attempts at getting Linux to work on older and or non-32-bit CPUs. I don't know whether or not those are any good, so your mileage may vary. Linux has exploded into an extremely large number of versions called distributions or just distros. And when I say exploded, I'm not kidding. As I mentioned in my intro video, DistroWatch lists nearly 900 of them. Most distros are based on an older, often more widely maintained distro. For example, Ubuntu, and no, it's not Ubuntu, is based on Debian, while SUSE was originally based on Red Hat. Each distro has its own package manager or app store, or sometimes lack thereof. For example, Red Hat created the RPM system, while Debian introduced deb packages. Both see widespread usage, and they're not the only ones. Linux has a reputation for being harder to use than other systems. This is not entirely true, but Linux operates differently from Windows under the hood, and even the graphical interface can be significantly different. Note that I say can be, not is. How the GUI acts and how the user interacts with it is very flexible. The old default of I can't figure anything out has been influenced by Windows, and to a lesser degree Mac OS, and on some distros it acts almost exactly like Windows. See, for example, the old Lindows distro. There is literally nothing you can do on Windows that can't be replicated on Linux. Either a program has an equivalent program, for example, Photoshop can largely be replaced with the GIMP, or else the Windows software can be run directly on Linux using Wine or some other method. There is pretty much no hardware that Linux can't operate and no task it can't do, whether it's programming, writing, gaming, watching movies, browsing the internet, acting as a server, or whatever. In short, Linux makes a great daily driver if you're already comfortable with Unix-like systems. But if you're not, you may want to stick with Windows or Mac. And that wraps things up for this episode. Stay tuned for the next episode where I'll be covering BSD. If you liked this video, please thumb it up. If you didn't, well, I guess that's your problem, isn't it? If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section and I'll get around to answering them eventually, I swear. I'm always interested in suggestions on what OSs to cover. If If you want to see me cover a particular OS, leave your suggestion in the comments section and I'll see what I can do. My name is Eric, and thanks for watching this episode of Daily Drivers.